According to the UN, there are about 243 million drug users worldwide. 1 in 200 are considered problem drug users. The most persistent message from drug lobbyists is that the war on drugs has failed and that historic attempts at prohibition were a disaster. This message dominates nearly every discussion, media release, and article. It leaves an impression in the public's mind that governments have always been fighting a long, costly, but losing war against illicit drugs, and any attempts at prohibition only lead to locking up more users and increases crime. Hollywood adds to the narrative with films like Bonnie and Clyde, Public Enemy, Road to Perdition, Lawless, and many others. But what specific wars are being referred to? And was the prohibition really responsible for mafia dons like Al Capone? Someone once wrote that it takes 6 truths to overtake 1 lie. And as with this history, we'll find that it's far more complex and will highlight periods when the drug trade was not only perfectly legal, but a massive source of government revenue. In the late 1600s, smoking opium in China was very common. The Dutch, through the East India Company, bought cheap opium from India and traded it with China. In 1699, 87 tonnes of opium were exported. Other countries joined in the lucrative trade, including French, Portuguese, the British, as they competed to gain control of the opium trade. Eventually, by the late 17th century, the British East India Company dominated the trade, growing massive amounts of opium in India and exporting to China while importing huge amounts of tea, silk and ceramics. But by the 19th century, what was referred to as white man's smoke or foreign dust, the distraction of the more established and wealthy classes, now spread to China's working class backbone, the labourers and villagers. The following first-hand accounts give a picture of just how overwhelming the problem was. The Sichuan province provided the richest soil for poppy cultivation, but the labouring classes show a noticeable decline of physique and capacity for work. In Yunnan, I practically saw the whole population given over to its abuse. The ravages it is making on men, women and children are deplorable. Probably the majority of victims take it up as a temporary relief, many beginning in childhood. The mother will give a baby a whiff to stop its crying. The most notable outward effect of this indulgent is physical weakness and lassitude. The opium smoker cannot work hard. He finds it hard to apply his mind to a problem or his body to a task. Apart from the devastating health effects, this nation experienced a reduction in business activity, a fall in living standards, and the virtual standstill of its civil service. One foreigner describes the effects of opium consumption on a soldier and head policeman, who are some of the personnel escorting his party. All the members of the Chinese party carried opium pipes, including a head policeman. Minister Lin calculated that in 1839, Chinese opium smokers consumed 100 million taels worth of the drug, while the entire spending of the government came to 400 million taels. This prompted him to appeal to Queen Victoria to stop the trade. He concluded, "If we continue to allow this trade to flourish, in a few dozen years we'll find ourselves not only with no soldiers to resist the enemy, but also with no money to equip the army." Later, the Chinese government once again demanded payment for tea, silk and ceramics in silver, causing a significant revenue imbalance for the British. Chinese officials went on to confiscate more than 1,000 tonnes of the drug, then openly burned opium on a beach and shut down all trade and demanded foreign merchants leave. This became the pretext to the First Opium War. During what was referred to as a century of humiliation from 1839 and then ending in 1860 against both the British-French alliance, this era ended with the Chinese government legalising opium trade and the 99-year lease of Hong Kong to the British. It is particularly interesting that the most famous British Governor-General of India, Warren Hastings, disclosed his conflicting approach towards opium when it came to domestic and foreign policy. Opium, he said, is a pernicious article of luxury, which ought not to be permitted, but for the purpose of foreign commerce only. In 1906, China, once again gripped by the ravages of opium addiction, issued a declaration. It said that it wanted to limit the cultivation of opium and opium smoking to be abandoned within 10 years. But the edict ran into many problems. First, the Chinese government officials, 90% of whom were confirmed opium smokers, and about 50% had a vested interest in the continuing trade. And then, of course, the British. They had fought 2 costly wars, and they weren't about to suffer another full-scale economic loss. Paraphrasing one person's observations, it was the triumph of the law of business over that of human affairs. The old central system was now in decline. By 1911, the imperial empire was dead and the Chinese Republic was born. After decades of senseless war and destruction, opium trading had made some nations exceedingly rich while incapacitating another ancient one. This quote sums up the close of the era. So long as a commodity remains in the currents of trade, the law of trade must reign. The balance sheet must balance. It's difficult to get a commodity into these currents, but once you've got a commodity in, it's impossible to get it out. The law of unintended consequences would come full circle to unleash its horrors of drug abuse in the West. In a twist of historical irony, the introduction of opium into the US began with the Chinese immigrating to find work as mining and railroad labourers. It counters the view that early colonisation of the US was filled with pious Christian pilgrims fleeing persecution. In fact, this period marks the first time in American history that heavy drinking, smoking opium and guzzling laudanum was commonly found in most homes and ranches. The following timeline gives an indication of how these events unfolded. By the mid-1800s, the nefarious opium dens, once found everywhere in China, were now a feature of the US social landscape. As historian Thomas Knoll pointed out, Western cities were modelled on Eastern ones and often had more in common with the urban East than the frontier West. At a time when modern medicine was still in its infancy and opium was administered even as a cure for alcoholism, doctors extensively prescribed opiates such as morphine, laudanum, paregoric, and codeine. They were used for coughing, toothache, tuberculosis, headaches, depression, menstrual cramps, sleeplessness, and even as a soothing baby tonic. The key point here is the striking similarity with the earlier Chinese trade and prohibition attempts that are now mirrored in early America. Expanding and profitable trade becomes the focus that rationalises the incapacitating health effects and community destruction on the American Indians. The Osage Indians were particularly affected. They were known to trade a good horse for as little as a bottle or 2 of whiskey. An Indian squaw offers her 4-year-old son for a few bottles of whiskey, and in 1841, a chief bulltail offered his grown daughter for a keg of whiskey. Comparable with Chinese attempts at prohibition, earlier localised attempts to limit the trade and sale of whiskey and other spirits to the Indian country began as early as 1802. But opium use was also spreading quickly. States such as California and San Francisco could easily access the drug, and now it was spreading east into New York, Chicago, St. Louis, and New Orleans. Attempts to limit opium use began in 1878 and 1881, and later in 1890 to close opium dens. But it was the Civil War that put an end to all these prohibition attempts. This war would unleash unparalleled human loss and equally bring huge economic national expenses. The following slides show the war statistics and dead. Approximately 622 soldiers died in combat. A recent number put it at as much as 850,000, and nearly 500,000 were wounded. These numbers would remain unparalleled in any other time of US war history. Opium and alcohol were used widely and as anesthetics, pain relief due to the scale and injury of the war. Medical procedures on broken bones and severe flesh wounds mostly involved amputation. The sheer scale of the war meant an estimated 1 in 4 families lost a family member, and the prescribed medication to relieve the emotional pain for grieving relatives was once again opium. In the book Dark Paradise, David Courtwright quotes, "Maimed and shattered survivors from 100 battlefields, diseased and disabled soldiers released from hostile prisons, anguished and hopeless wives and mothers, made so by the slaughter of those dearest to them, have found, many of them, temporary relief from their sufferings in opium." The following are the same examples of the ease in which opium was being administered during the war. William H. Taylor, an assistant surgeon in the Confederate Army, wrote, "How are your bowels? If they were open, I administered a plug of opium. If they were shut, I gave them a plug of blue mass." Another surgeon devised an even speedier method. While on horseback, he'd pour morphine on the back of his hand and ask soldiers to lick it as he went past. The following slide gives an indication of the amounts that were distributed. The end of the Civil War and the close of the 19th century witnessed rampant substance abuse. Yet even as some raised the alarm about addiction, often the solution was substituting one drug for another. For example, in 1884, the famous Sigmund Freud recommended cocaine as a means of treating morphine and alcohol addiction. But once again, health and societal concerns were being outweighed with weightier government concerns. Rumours of war quickly escalated, culminating in the First World War of 1914, and the US found itself in defence of the British, the very nation it had fought centuries earlier for independence. During this period, there were growing calls for national alcohol prohibition to be implemented as a war measure. Beer was dubbed Kaiser Brew. Proponents argued that grain should be made into bread for fighting and not for liquor. Anti-German sentiment aided the prohibitionists' efforts, but prohibition would not gain momentum until the close of World War I in 1918. The year 1920 is marked as a time of the US national alcohol prohibition. This time is often seen synonymous with the hard-hitting efforts of crusading, high-minded, middle-class do-gooders set on censoring the vices of the Roaring Twenties, including the enjoyment of alcohol and every other vice. But as presented so far, the social and cultural background is one where alcohol and opium were already part of the social background. By 1915, addiction was rampant amongst immigrants, sex workers, veterans, but also middle-class housewives and physicians themselves. The profile of a typical opium addict was a 19th century middle-aged Caucasian woman that was married with children and financially stable. Products containing opium were sold by pharmacies as well as shoemakers, tailors and grocery stores. Laudanum, the mixture of alcohol and opium, was taken commonly to relieve colds, diarrhoea, coughs, menopause, tuberculosis, and of course to facilitate amputations. Coca-Cola, first created in 1886, contained a small amount of cocaine. Many cultivated opium poppies in their gardens. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was marketed with morphine and alcohol as a perfectly harmless and pleasant way to produce quiet sleep and relieve pain in children. As one author put it, it was only a short step from using opium as medicine to treat cholera and dysentery to using it for recreation. As a result, the habit of opium use spread quickly. A lesser-known fact, of course, that is left out about this historic legislation is that prohibition did not specifically forbid the purchase and consumption of intoxicating liquors. For example, those who had already stockpiled alcoholic beverages could legally drink them. Since the Act took a year to come into effect, there was plenty of time to accumulate liquor. As one example, Spencer Penrose in 1919, anticipating prohibition, purchased 2,400 cases of the finest and rarest liquors. The New York Times interpreted the law for its readers. Some other lesser-known events that give context to the political and economic climate that led up to the prohibition include the growing recognition of the ill effects as a shift was becoming more apparent from manual labour to mechanisation. The Industrial Revolution was rapidly changing the production landscape. Alcohol and drugs were beginning to be seen as not compatible with mechanisation. as most work involved operating machinery, large-scale mining, industrial logging, and railroad engines. These required precision, concentration, and punctuality. Alcohol alone was estimated to cause about 35,000 deaths per year. Added to this, the original alcohol temperance movement gradually embraced other social reforms that were becoming more apparent with the rise of industrialism. They included child labour, women's suffrage, removing poverty and crime, corruption, the mistreatment of prisoners, the abolition of slavery, and of course, women's rights. This last point is particularly important. Working women often had no control of their wages and no claim on their husband's earnings. From the prohibitionist point of view, a man could and would drink up his wages, and if his wife had any, hers as well. With no backup welfare, this was an increasing problem. But once again, not unlike the British opium trade, the human cost took a backseat to the taxes derived from alcohol and opium that were a boon for government revenue. Up until the income tax assessment, as much as 40% of federal revenue came from alcohol tax alone. And in New York, 75% of the state's revenue came from taxes. The prohibition threatened to bring down the government bureaucratic system, costing the federal government $11 billion in tax revenue. In spite of this, prohibition was voted through, but it's unsurprising that it soon became quite apparent that many law enforcement and government bureaucrats would find any means to secure their paychecks. What isn't explained is that well before 1919, organised crime existed in Chicago for well over a century, beginning roughly in the 1850s. As one author put it, organised crime always seeks to commercialise and exploit human nature. It's no surprise that gangsters found a lucrative market to extort before the national prohibition in 1920. Distilling whiskey illegally and diluting it with other additives was already commonplace as a means of avoiding taxes, licence fees, and increasing profitability. The most common markets were prostitution, newswire, and gambling. Chicago gangsters created, operated, and managed hundreds of brothels, often through false fronts of roadhouses, saloons, and resorts. Gambling joints were often organised and overseen by infamous names such as Studs Lonergan, Montens, James O'Leary, and of course, Al Capone. These gangsters all belonged to powerful groups of organised criminals and already had significant influence on the government and police forces in Chicago. This is a key point. Without the already existing corruption of law enforcement, criminal gangs would never have acquired the capital to exponentially grow their operations and continue to bribe a wide range of public servants during and after the prohibition. News of prohibition simply meant that they were able to upscale their existing business models and networked amongst each other that included their government contacts in a way that was not seen previously. Gangsters hired men to smuggle alcohol from the Caribbean and hijack whiskey from Canada and bring it to the US. Many members of the US Coast Guard made significant profits by escorting rum-running boats into the ports. A common method of bribery was known as a free night. Bootleggers paid agents to be absent for a specific period of time at night, during which smugglers could bring in large amounts of alcohol. This created a growing symbiotic relationship between government and criminal organisations. Vast amounts of money that went with these operations fostered even greater, rampant public service corruption. One of the major bootleggers was George Remus. He had around 1,000 salespeople on his payroll. Many of them were law enforcement and included politicians, prohibition agents, federal marshals, up to the highest levels of government, including US Attorney General Harry Doherty. He was found guilty of selling alcohol illegally, pardoning offenders, and taking bribes from bootleggers. Remus estimated that half his takings went towards bribes. Even Congress had its own bootlegger, George Cassidy. He was allowed access into the House and Senate buildings at all times. The most famous prohibition officer, Ira Reeves, became disillusioned due to the widespread drinking with impunity from state legislatures to the entire police departments. In one incident, Reeves tried to shut down a brewery. In response, the chief of police in Trenton had Reeves' agents arrested for carrying concealed guns without a permit, while over in Essex County, local police showed up to protect a brewing still. Reeves then discovered that his own agents had been accepting bribes. It comes as no surprise then that Al Capone's infamous Chicago organisation reportedly made $60 million in 1927 and had half the city's police on its payroll. In 1933, Prohibition comes to an end after 13 years. But in recent decades, some academics and researchers have re-examined Prohibition history and acknowledged that some of its successes have often gone unrecognised. During that period, there was a growing awareness of the dangers of alcoholism and drug abuse to societal, mental and physical health. The Prohibition movements, at the very least, made government acknowledge the seriousness of the issues surrounding addiction and took steps to limit public access to alcohol and drugs. In 1906, the federal government, under Theodore Roosevelt, passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, requiring any dangerous or addictive drugs to appear on labels of products. 3 years later, Smoking Opium Exclusion Act banned the importation of opiates used purely for recreational purposes. And in 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Act regulated and taxed the production, importation and distribution of opiates and coca products. Patients were now required to have a prescription for potentially harmful narcotic drugs. Daniel Orkins' The Last Call, The Rise and Fall of the Prohibition, shows that there were some positive public health benefits. The death rate from alcoholism was cut by 80% in 1921 from pre-war levels. Death from cirrhosis of the liver in men fell from 29.5% per 100,000 in 1911 to 10.7% per 100,000 in 1929. The documentary Prohibition by award-winning filmmaker Ken Burns makes a similar observation. The US didn't get back to pre-Prohibition drinking levels until the late 1930s, which coincided with the Great Depression, and really didn't surpass the most drunken periods in American history until the 1970s. Another boon during the Prohibition era was for California's grape growers, which increased their acreage about 700% in the first 5 years of the Prohibition, meeting a booming demand for homemade wine. But since that time, governments have continued to have a troubled relationship with drugs, their domestic and foreign policy often at a clash. It's said that opium smoking is a habit that has financed empires and made fortunes all over the world. Government-sanctioned war and illicit drug trades remain forged links throughout history. Not unlike the corrupt law officials during the Prohibition era that partnered with organised crime, today multiple investigations and testimonies have uncovered credible and troubling accounts of governments across the world that have partnered with drug cartels for various political purposes, including geopolitical warfare and narco-terrorism, such as Al-Qaeda, which funds its activities via Afghanistan's opium harvest, valued at $3.1 billion in 2006. Of course, various US government departments continue consorting with drug cartels, particularly after World War II, as nations were being divided between the Western and communist victors. The most famous example is the Corsican Mafia. In the late 1940s, the CIA funneled arms and funds to the Corsican Mafia in return for their assistance to break up widespread labour strikes in France that were threatening to establish communist control over the old port of Marseille. In return, the CIA supported the Corsican crime syndicate to help set up the trafficking network known as the French Connection. It allowed heroin to be smuggled from Turkey to France and shipped to the US. In 1988, Senator John Kerry acknowledged this nexus in a speech addressing the Subcommittee on Narcotics, Terrorism and International Operations. And I quote, "From what we have learnt these past months, our declaration on war against drugs seems to have produced a war of words and not action. Our borders are inundated with more narcotics than in any other time before. It seems as though stopping drug trafficking in the United States has been a secondary US foreign policy objective, sacrificed repeatedly for other political and institutional goals such as changing government of Nicaragua, supporting the government of Panama, using drug-running organisations as intelligence assets, and protecting military and intelligence sources from possible compromise through involvement in drug trafficking." Ironically, Senator Kerry went on to later serve under President Obama, whose administration was implicated after a major year-long investigation reported the US departments secretly worked with Mexican drug lords. The Sinaloa cartel imported tons of drugs into the US while annihilating their competitors. US departments ensured Sinaloa leaders would not be prosecuted for their list of major crimes. But the US is facing not only enemies from within, but without. Dr. Joseph Douglas is a national security analyst with an expertise in defence policy, including international narcotics and trafficking. His book, Red Cocaine, documents the Russian communist efforts to flood the West with illicit drugs as a form of covert warfare. Could this also be the aims of drug lobbyists who acknowledge the endgame of total drug liberalisation? Princeton professor Ethan Nadelman, described by Rolling Stone as the real drug czar and the point man for drug policy reform, is widely regarded as the leading proponent of drug policy development in the United States and abroad. He founded and directed the Drug Policy Alliance and currently serves on the advisory board of the Open Society Foundation's Global Drug Project that was founded by billionaire George Soros, the most prominent private donor for worldwide drug liberalisation. Nadelman confesses the aims of drug lobbying. Personally, when I talk about legalisation, I mean three things. The first is to make drugs such as marijuana, cocaine, and heroin legal. Many lobbyists like Nadelman incessantly shout about the failure of the war on drugs, but either ignorantly or deliberately they conceal the truth that if governments have fought this battle, it's with one hand tied behind their back. Nadelman confesses the aims of drug lobbying. Personally, when I talk about legalisation, I mean three things. The first is to make drugs such as marijuana, cocaine, and heroin legal. Many lobbyists like Nadelman incessantly shout about the failure of the war on drugs, but either ignorantly or deliberately they conceal the truth that if governments have fought this battle, it's with one hand tied behind their back. So what are the real lessons we can learn from the history of the war on drugs? In seeking to research this topic, the overwhelming theme that presents itself is the incessant pain and brokenness of humanity, most often brought about by the ravages of war and those who are always ready to take advantage. It's the reason illicit drugs have always been able to find abundant and fertile ground. But this history is also a lesson on what is referred to as blowback, or the law of unintended consequences. This author's prophetic observations just over 100 years ago sum it up, and I quote, "That the East India Company might be loosing an uncontrollable monster not only in China but on the world hardly occurred to the great Warren Hastings. The British chickens might, a century later, come home to roost in Australia and South Africa was too remote a possibility even for speculative inquiry." The war on drugs has not failed, because in the long history of illicit drugs, governments have either explicitly or implicitly supported its trade, or lacked the political will to apply sound policy.